The room smelled like new carpet and stale coffee, and the particular dry warmth of a building whose heating system has been running since October and will not be turned off until April regardless of what the weather outside is doing. The conference table was oval, dark wood, the kind that exists in every academic publisher's office in every northeastern American city, functional, slightly formal, communicating that what happens here is serious without being theatrical about it. Professor Martin Wiseman was speaking. He spoke the way he always spoke, with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been the most prepared person in most of the rooms he had entered for the past 30 years. He was describing the central argument of Chapter 3 of the manuscript that had my name on it, the manuscript I had been writing for 7 years. He said the wrong color. It was a small thing, a specific shade of indigo. Not any indigo, but the particular deep blue produced by the Yoruba dyer process, which has a name and a history and a distinction from the indigo used in Mali and Bogolanfini, that I had spent 3 months learning to articulate correctly, that I had eventually gotten right only after a conversation with a textile conservator at the Smithsonian, 6 weeks before I submitted the final draft. I had gotten it wrong in the first version of that chapter. The error existed in Draft 4 and Draft 5 and Draft 6. I caught it in Draft 7. I corrected it in a footnote. The footnote said, "Note on terminology. The author initially described this shade as consistent with Mali and Bogolanfini. This was incorrect. The process described here is Yoruba dyer, characterized by a distinct tonal depth resulting from the specific mordanting practices of Ogun State artisans." The author thanks Dr. Constance Afolabi of the Smithsonian's African Art Program for the correction. The footnote existed because I had been wrong and found my own error. Nobody else had seen the wrong version. Nobody else had the draft history. Nobody else had the Smithsonian email exchange. Weissman said the original, incorrect shade. He said it with confidence, the way people say things they believe they know. Simone Cross, the editor at the press who had been corresponding with me about the manuscript for 18 months, who had read every version I submitted, who had written 63 emails to my personal address about structure and argument and chapter flow, looked down at the copy of the manuscript in front of her. She turned to Chapter 3. She found the relevant footnote. She wrote something in the notebook she kept to her left. She did not look up. I did not say anything. Not yet. My name is Diana Osei. I am 41 years old. I am a first-generation Ghanaian-American, the daughter of a seamstress named Abina, who taught me to look at cloth before I learned to read. I have been an adjunct professor in the African Studies Department at Harwell University for 8 years. I have a doctorate from the same university, which I completed 11 years ago, which should have led to a permanent position, and which led instead to a series of visiting roles and short-term contracts, and the specific kind of precarity that academia distributes to people like me, with the breezy certainty that we should feel grateful for the opportunity. 7 years ago, I started writing a book. The book is called The Woven Road: West African Textile Trade Routes and the Making of Global Fashion. It is about the movement of fabric and technique and aesthetic tradition from the Atlantic coast of West Africa into the global fashion industry, not as cultural appropriation, though that is part of it, but as a form of trade whose participants and innovators have been systematically uncredited in the historical record. It is about weavers, dyers, traders, women, mostly. It is about the specific deep knowledge that passes from hand to hand when someone teaches you to work cloth correctly, and about what gets lost when that transmission is interrupted, and about what endures when it is not. I wrote it because my mother taught me to look at cloth. I kept writing it because I found, in the archives and the markets and the workshops and the front porches of women in their 80s and 90s who had been weaving since before I was born, a world that the academic literature had been describing around the edges without ever looking directly at. I took it to Martin Wiseman in my 3rd year of writing it, because he was the department chair, because he had connections at 3 major academic presses, and because I needed someone in the institution to believe the book was worth completing. He read it. He gave me notes. Some of the notes were good. He introduced me to Simone Cross. He told people at conferences that he was working with a very promising junior scholar on an exciting project. He said this in the present tense, as if his involvement were active rather than advisory. I thought, this is how it works. You need the person who opens doors. You accept that the price of access is acknowledgement, and you tell yourself that acknowledgement is not the same as credit. I was wrong about what he meant by acknowledgement. I want to tell you about the day Simone Cross called me. I want to tell you what Wiseman had written in a letter to her press. And I want to tell you what happened in the conference room on a Tuesday in November, when the editor who had spent 18 months working with me on my book asked the man who claimed to have co-written it what color of indigo, appeared in Chapter 3's central footnote. Before I do, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever stood close enough to your work to learn its vocabulary, its shape, its argument close enough to describe it fluently in a room where you weren't present without ever getting close enough to know the places where you were wrong before you were right? Has anyone ever been present for the product without being present for the process? Because the process is where it lives. The wrong drafts, the late revisions, the conversation with the conservator that changed a footnote, those things are not in the published version. They are in the history of the work, which only exists in one place. In the person who made the errors and corrected them. I want to tell you about a woman named Adwa Amankwa. She was 91 years old when I met her, in the second year of my fieldwork, in a compound house in Kumasi, that her family had lived in for 4 generations. She had been weaving since she was 11. Her hands, when she worked, moved with a speed and precision that was impossible to watch without understanding that you were seeing something that had been built over 80 years of continuous practice, not mastery as a destination but mastery as a condition of being. The compound house had a central courtyard where the looms were set up in the early morning, when the light was right. 3 looms. Adwo's, her daughter's, and a third that her granddaughter used on weekends and school holidays. The sound of all 3 working at the same time was, I wrote in my field notes that night, less like machinery and more like conversation between people who have known each other so long they have stopped needing to finish their sentences. I had come with a translator, a man named Kofi, who had been recommended by the university's African Studies department in Accra, and who turned out to be better at his work than I had been told, which was already a high bar. Kofi understood that good translation was not word for word, but meaning for meaning, and that meaning sometimes arrived in silence, in gesture, in the direction of a glance. He did not rush the conversations. When Adwa paused to think, he let her pause. I spent 4 days in that compound. I interviewed Adwa for a total of perhaps 6 hours, spread across 3 sessions. Between sessions, I sat in the courtyard and watched and took notes on what I saw. The weaving process. The decisions embedded in each pass of the shuttle. The way that Adwa's daughter would glance at her mother's loom from across the courtyard, not to check the work she knew the work was correct, but the way you might glance at someone you love, confirming their presence. On the 3rd day, I asked Adwo about the indigo she used. I was trying to understand the relationship between the dyeing process and the weaving process, whether the dyer and the weaver were always the same person, or whether there was a division of knowledge between them. Adwoa explained, through Kofi, that in her family's tradition, the weaver understood the dye, because the dye was part of the pattern, that you could not make the right color decision in the weaving without knowing the chemistry of what you were working with. I wrote this down. I thought I understood it. I did not fully understand it yet. I would not fully understand it until I made the error in Chapter 3, and was corrected, and sat in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon thinking about why I had made the specific error I had made, and realized that I had written about the indigo as if the dye were a material property rather than a knowledge tradition. As if the color were something that happened to the cloth rather than something someone knew how to make. The footnote correction was not just a terminological adjustment. It was a correction of the conceptual framing, and I had gotten it wrong in the first place because I had not yet fully absorbed what Adwoa had been telling me about the relationship between knowing and making. On my last morning, she gave me a strip of kente cloth. Not a full piece, a strip, about 3 inches wide, cut from something she had made for a family ceremony the previous year. Gold and green and a deep specific blue that I recognized only later, when I was deep in the research, as the blue of her particular regional tradition. She said, through Kofi, who paused before translating, "You are looking at cloth the right way. Most people look at cloth to see the pattern. You are looking to see the decision." I have been thinking about that sentence for 5 years. The kente strip has been on my desk since I came home from that trip. It has been on every desk I have worked at during the writing of this book. I look at it when I can't find the word I need. I look at it when I have found the word but am not sure I am allowed to use it. I have looked at it approximately 9,000 times in the past 4 years. Kofi, who spent 4 days translating between an 80-year-old Ghanaian weaver and a 36-year-old Ghanaian-American academic, was present for more of my understanding of this book's argument than I gave him credit for in the field. He asked questions I had not thought to ask. He noticed when Adwo was saying something more than the literal meaning of her words, and found ways to communicate the surplus. He is in the acknowledgments of the published book, which is the least I could do and also, I know, insufficient. The voice memo I made after our last session with Adwa is 4 minutes and 37 seconds long. It contains her voice, through the translator, saying the sentence about looking at cloth, It contains the sound of the loom in the adjacent room. It contains, at the very end, after I stop speaking, about 8 seconds of the courtyard in the early morning, the sound of 3 looms working, the sound of weaving as conversation. I have listened to it more times than I can count. I played it the night before the editorial meeting. Quietly, in my kitchen, with the manuscript on the table and the kente strip beside it, I listened all the way through. Then I closed the binder. I made tea. I went to bed. My mother, Abina, was a seamstress in Accra before she came to this country. She is 73 now, and lives in Silver Spring, Maryland, and she has strong opinions about the book that she shares with me via a specific type of audio message that arrives on WhatsApp in the morning direct. Precise, sometimes contradictory, always worth thinking about. She never trained as an academic. She reads like one slowly, with a pencil, questioning everything. When I showed her the first complete draft, she read it over 3 weeks and sent me 47 WhatsApp messages. 45 of them were corrections or questions. One of them said, "I think you are finally writing what you actually know." One of them said, "Your grandmother would have had notes." Martin Wiseman has a PhD in European colonial history. He knows the literature on West Africa as it relates to the colonial period, the economic structures, the trade routes as documented by European sources, the political implications of textile trade. He is a serious scholar in his own field. His field is not mine. He knows the outside of what I know. He does not know the inside. He does not know, for instance, that I changed the title of Chapter 3 7 times. He does not know that the chapter was originally about trade routes chronologically, and became, in its 5th revision, about the knowledge embedded in the physical textile itself, a structural decision that changed the entire argument of the book. He did not know about this because I made the decision alone. At 2 in the morning, after a conversation with my mother, about the difference between knowing where something went and knowing why it was made. He does not know about the indigo footnote. He did not know what Simone would ask him about it. Let me tell you how the relationship with Wiseman developed, because it matters. He approached me in my 3rd year of writing the book. I had presented a chapter at an internal colloquium, not polished, not ready for public presentation, but solid enough that the argument was clear. He came to me afterward and said that the work was important, and that he wanted to help me find a publisher for it. He said this with the specific warmth of someone who had done this before, who understood the ecosystem of academic publishing in a way I didn't yet, and who was genuinely offering something useful. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was an adjunct professor on a 2-year contract. I did not have a permanent office. I shared a desk with Kwame and 2 other graduate students on a rotation. I had 1 publication in a good journal and 1 in a mid-tier one. I was doing the work that mattered to me in the conditions that the institution had decided were appropriate for someone at my stage and in my position. The institution had decided that someone at my stage and in my position was not someone who needed resources or stability. The institution had decided this with the particular serenity of a system that has never had occasion to reconsider. Wiseman gave me access. He read chapters. He responded with notes that were often intelligent, sometimes wrong in ways that I could not always articulate clearly, because his wrongness was the wrongness of someone reading outside their training. Confident errors are harder to dispute than uncertain ones. He invited me to dinners with visiting scholars. He mentioned my work to people at conferences. He wrote a letter on my behalf for a fellowship application that succeeded, and gave me 9 months of protected writing time. I am not able to say he did nothing for me. He did things for me. The question is what he understood those things to cost. What I noticed, over 3 years, was that the word he used for my book shifted. Early on, Diana's book. Later, our project. Later still, in a conference reception that I attended and stood near him at, the book I've been working on with Diana Osei about West African textile trade routes, and I stood near him with a glass of wine in my hand and heard how he had assembled the sentence, and I noticed that my name had moved from subject to preposition, and I did not say anything. I did not say anything because I did not yet know what to do with what I was noticing, because the cost of saying something was higher than the cost of noticing, because the access he provided was real, and the alternative, doing the work without it, was also real and harder. I have thought about this many times since then. About when I should have said something, about whether saying something would have changed anything, or only changed my access to the things I needed, about whether the calculation I made was reasonable or whether it was the calculation the system trains people like me to make, so that the people like Wiseman don't have to reconsider anything. I do not have a clean answer. I had the book to write, I wrote it, and when the thing I had feared, in the back of my mind, finally happened in the form I had not quite anticipated, I was in a room with an editor who had read the work closely enough to ask the right question. That is the story. All of it, including the parts where I was calculating. The call came on a Monday morning in September. I was in my office, the shared office on the third floor of the Humanities building. 2 desks, the other belonging to Kwame Asante, who was finishing his dissertation on post-colonial Ghanaian literature, and who had the particular quality of a person who understood that the best way to share an office with someone who needed to concentrate was to make himself effectively invisible. The desk faced the window. The kente strip was in its place. The manuscript was in a folder on the left. Simone's number came up on my phone. She never called in the morning. We corresponded by email, occasional video call, the slow and careful rhythm of academic publishing, where every substantive decision requires 3 rounds of internal review before anyone will say anything definitive in writing. I answered. She said, "Diana, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm asking you first." The specific quality of her voice not alarmed, very precise in the way that people become precise when they are managing their own reaction to something, told me before the next sentence what kind of something it was going to be. "I received a letter last week," she said, "from Professor Wiseman. He describes himself as co-author of the manuscript. He is proposing that the book go forward under both your names." I looked at the kente strip, gold and green and the deep specific blue. "He wrote you a letter," I said. "He did. Co-author. That's what the letter says." I was quiet for a moment, not because I was at a loss, because I was very carefully putting things into the order they needed to be in. "Simone," I said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you read the letter, what was your first reaction?" A pause. "Then, I thought about the manuscript. The one I've been working with you on for 18 months. She paused again. "I thought, this doesn't match what I've been reading." "No," I said. "It doesn't." I looked at my desk, at the kente strip, at the manuscript folder, at the stack of 4 composition notebooks that contained my field notes from 3 years of research trips. "I'd like to talk to you in person," I said. "Can we set that up?" I was going to suggest the same thing, she said. "I was also going to suggest that Professor Wiseman join us, if you're comfortable with that." I thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. "Yes," I said. "I'd like that very much." I did not go to Wiseman's office. I know this surprises some people when I tell the story. A natural response would be, confront him directly, demand an explanation, force the conversation before any institutional process takes over. I did not do that. I went instead to the door of Kwame's side of our shared office and I said, "Something happened. I need to tell someone and I need to tell them now." Kwame looked up from his dissertation chapter. He is 29 years old, and he is going to be a very good scholar, and one of the reasons I know this is that he has the quality rare in graduate students of listening without immediately generating a response. He listened to the whole thing. He did not say "that's insane" or "what are you going to do?" He said, "What do you need right now?" I said, "I need to read the manuscript again." He nodded. He turned back to his dissertation. We sat in that office for the next 2 hours and we did not speak. Kwame typed. I read. The shared silence had the quality of work being done, which is one of the most underrated forms of company. At some point he got up and made tea in the small electric kettle we had pooled for, and he set a cup on my side of the shared desk without saying anything. I drank it without saying anything. He sat back down and kept typing. At the end of the 2 hours, when I had finished reading chapter 3 and had sat for a while with the footnote, I said, "He read the submitted manuscript, not the drafts." Kwame looked up. "Right. So he knows the argument as it arrived, not how it got there." "Right. He won't know where it was wrong before it was right." Kwame thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "What was wrong before it was right?" I told him about the indigo footnote, about the Smithsonian conversation, about the 6 weeks between the conversation and the correction. He said, "He won't know that." "No." "Does the editor know it?" "She's been working with me on the manuscript. She's read every submitted version, but not the draft history." Kwame was quiet for a moment. Then, "So she'll be able to tell that the footnote exists, but not why it exists, unless she asks." "Will she ask?" I picked up the manuscript. I looked at chapter 3. I looked at the footnote that said the author thanks Dr. Constance Afolabi, and I thought about the specific way Simone read carefully, with annotation, going back to passages she had questioned in previous versions and checking whether the revision addressed what she'd flagged. The 18 months of correspondence had taught me something about how she thinks. She thinks like someone for whom the process of a manuscript matters as much as its product. "I think she will ask," I said. I took the manuscript home. I read it that night, not chapter 3 specifically, but the whole thing, all 347 pages. Not because I needed to review the argument, because I needed to be inside the whole work before I walked into that meeting. There is a specific kind of reading you do when you have written something, a reading where your body recognizes the rhythms before your eyes reach the words, where you move faster and slower in the way that only happens when the architecture is familiar. I read the book that way. Quickly in the places I was confident. Slowly in the places I had been uncertain. Very slowly in the places where the argument had changed direction. I read the footnote 3 times. I thought about Dr. Afolabi's email. I thought about the voice memo of the Kumasi conversation. I thought about Adwa Amankwa saying, "The cloth knows who made it." I did not bring the email from Dr. Afolabi. I did not bring a binder of documentation. I brought what I had, 7 years of knowing the work from the inside. I want to tell you about my undergraduate seminar. This was the Wednesday of that week, 2 days after Simone's call, 3 days before the editorial meeting. 22 students, mostly sophomores. A course on African aesthetic traditions in a global context, not the most popular course in the department, but consistently full, with a waiting list, because the students who found it tended to become the students who came back. We were discussing textile as archive. The idea that cloth carries historical information not in spite of being functional but because of it, that the decisions embedded in the making of a piece of fabric record a moment in time more honestly than a written account, because they were not made for the purpose of recording. A student named Marcus, not related to any other Marcus in any story you've heard from me, just a sophomore from Queens who wore the same gray hoodie every week and asked better questions than most graduate students, said, "But who gets to read the archive?" If the knowledge is embedded in the making process, and the making process is passed down within specific communities, then the archive is only accessible to people who were already inside the tradition. I looked at him. I said, "Say more about that." He thought about it. Like you can analyze the cloth. You can describe the pattern, the colors, the structure. But to know what a specific decision in the making means, why this color was chosen here, why this thread was added at this point in the pattern, you have to know the conversation that happened around the loom while it was being made. And that conversation isn't in the cloth. Right, I said. So the archive is partial, by definition. Every archive is partial, I said. The question is whether the gap is acknowledged, whether the scholar who reads the archive is honest about what they cannot see from the outside. Marcus wrote something in his notebook. I watched him write and thought, he will be a good scholar. I thought about this exchange, in the car on the way home, and I thought about the editorial meeting 2 days away, and I thought about what it meant that Martin Weissman had read my book for 3 years and had never once asked me, "Why did you change the indigo footnote between drafts 4 and 7? He had not known there were 7 drafts. He had not known there was a draft 4. He had read the submitted manuscript, which was the version that reached the press, which was already the 7th iteration. He had read the product, not the process. The archive was partial, and he had not acknowledged the gap. The night before the editorial meeting, I sat with the manuscript for 2 hours. Not reading it exactly, I had already read every word of it more times than I could count. I was sitting with it the way you sit with something that has been part of your life long enough to have a texture independent of its content. The physical manuscript is 347 pages, double-spaced, in a black binder that I bought at an office supply store in my 3rd year of writing. The binder is now slightly warped from being carried in bags in various states of fullness. There are sticky tabs along the right edge, marking the chapters and the major subsections. In the margins, my handwriting in blue ink, questions I had asked myself, answers I had found, references to check, lines I had written, and then deleted and then partially restored in different form. The manuscript is full of evidence of thinking, but the evidence is not documentary. It is just mine. It looks exactly the way a 7-year intellectual project looks when it has been lived in by one person. I opened to chapter 3, to the footnote about the indigo, the corrected version. The author thanks Dr. Constance Afolabi of the Smithsonian's African Art Program for the correction. I turned to the back of the binder, where I keep a pocket folder with documents related to the research. The folder contained, among other things, an email printout from Dr. Afolabi dated August 14th of the previous year. The subject line, Yoruba, Adair versus Malian Bogolanfini, quick question. Her response, 3 paragraphs, the 3rd of which contained the correction. My reply, this is exactly what I needed. Thank you. I'll correct the footnote. I had not thought of this as documentation I would need. I had thought of it as correspondence I kept, because keeping correspondence was how I worked. I put the folder back. I looked at the kente strip on my desk, gold and green and the deep specific blue of Adwa Amankwa's tradition. I thought about what she had said. You are looking to see the decision. I played the voice memo again. Her voice, through the translator, and under it the sound of the compound children somewhere in the distance, a bird, the rhythmic sound of the loom in the room adjacent to where we were sitting. Her voice saying something in Twi that the translator rendered, after a pause, as, "The cloth knows who made it. It will tell you, if you ask correctly." I listened to the whole thing, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Then I closed the binder. I made tea. I went to bed. In the morning I put on the dress my mother had sent me 3 years ago, dark green, printed cotton, Ghanaian fabric. I carried the kente strip in my bag. I took the manuscript. I did not bring the email from Dr. Afalabi. I did not bring a binder of documentation. I brought what I had, 7 years of knowing the work from the inside. The editorial meeting was at 10 on a Tuesday. Simone's office was on the 4th floor of a building, 3 blocks from the university. The conference room was smaller than I had imagined. Round table, 6 chairs, a window that faced north and let in a flat gray November light. There was a whiteboard on one wall with something half erased on it, the remnants of a previous meeting's diagram that no one had bothered to clean fully. I arrived 5 minutes early. Simone was already there, her notebook open on the table. She stood when I came in. We did not speak about the reason we were there. We spoke about the building's elevator, which was being replaced, and about the coffee, which was better than I expected from an institutional carafe. She asked how the book was doing. I said I had been making small corrections to the index. She said that was always the last thing and also the most tedious. We talked about index methodology for 3 minutes, with the specificity of people for whom this was a real topic of interest, which it was, for both of us, and which also served as a way of establishing that we were 2 professionals who had been working together seriously for 18 months, not 2 people who had just met. Weissman arrived at 10:02. He had the ease of a man who had attended 100 meetings like this, academic, procedural, collegial, and who had never had occasion to be nervous in one. He greeted Simone by first name. He greeted me with a hand on my shoulder that lingered 2 seconds longer than I would have chosen. He sat to my left. There were 2 other people at the table. The press's editorial director, a woman named Carol Huang, who said almost nothing for the first 40 minutes, and a junior editor named Ted who was there in a witnessing capacity, and who took notes on a laptop in the corner. Simone opened. She said, "Thank you both for making time. I want to begin by saying that this meeting is a conversation, not a determination. The press is committed to proceeding with the Woven Road. What we want to clarify, before we finalize the contract details, is the nature of the authorship arrangement." She looked at Weissman. "Martin, can you describe your contribution to the manuscript in its current form?" Weissman nodded. He was comfortable. He had thought about this. He said that he had been a central intellectual interlocutor in the development of the project from early on. He said that he had provided significant guidance on the framing of the historical argument. He said that his editorial input had shaped the structure of several chapters. He said that his professional introduction had opened the door to the press's interest in the first place. He said he felt that these contributions, taken together, constituted a co-authorial relationship by any reasonable definition of the term. He spoke for about 4 minutes. He was fluent. He was not lying about what he had done. He was shaping it. And here's the thing about what he said. Most of it was true. He had read chapters. He had given notes. He had made the introduction to Simone. The notes had sometimes been useful. The introduction had been essential. The word co-author was the only word that was wrong, and it was wrong in the specific way that a small mislabeling is wrong. The substance is there, but the container misrepresents what it holds. Simone wrote something in her notebook. Then she said, "Diana, could you walk me through the development of Chapter 3? Specifically, I'm interested in how the central argument evolved from your initial conception." I had been waiting for a question. I had not known what question. This was a good one. I talked for 12 minutes. I talked about the 3rd chapter's original structure, which was chronological, and the decision in the 5th draft to reorganize it around the concept of embedded knowledge rather than temporal sequence. I talked about what that decision required going back to the field notes, reinterpreting conversations I had recorded 2 years earlier in the light of a structural insight I had not yet had when I recorded them. I talked about the specific interview with a weaver in Lagos who had described her mother's teaching method in a way that gave me the language I needed to articulate what the chapter was actually about. I talked about the Smithsonian conversation. I talked about the footnote. I said, the chapter originally described the indigo shade as consistent with Malian Bogolanfini. That was incorrect. The process I was describing was Yoruba Adair. I caught the error in the 7th draft. after a conversation with Dr. Constance Afolabi, and corrected it in a footnote that acknowledges the mistake. Simone was looking at the manuscript. She turned to the footnote. She had already read it. Obviously she had been working with this manuscript for 18 months, but she looked at it again now, with the particular attention of someone who is placing a piece of information into a context that has just been specified. Then she looked at Weissman. She said, "Martin, what shade of indigo is referenced in chapter 3? The silence that followed was brief, perhaps 2 seconds, but it had a weight to it. Weissman said the shade he had said before, the Malian-Bogolan-Fini shade, the incorrect one, the one that existed in draft 4, and no longer existed in draft 7. He said it with complete confidence. He said it the way you say something you have read, not the way you say something you have checked. He had read the submitted manuscript. The submitted manuscript had the corrected footnote, but he had absorbed the chapter's argument through the lens of his own prior knowledge, which included a general familiarity with West African textile traditions, but not the specific distinction between these two processes, and so when the question arrived, he answered from that general familiarity rather than from the text. He had not remembered the footnote. He had not noticed that the footnote was a correction of something. He had read past it, because for him it was a detail rather than a turning point. For me it was a turning point, because I had been wrong and then right, and the distance between wrong and right had required a 3-month conversation with a specialist and a revision of the chapter's central terminology. Simone wrote in her notebook. She did not look up. I did not correct him. I waited. Carol Huang, who had been silent for the entire meeting, looked down at her copy of the manuscript. I watched her turn to chapter 3. I watched her find the footnote. I watched something happen in her face, not dramatic, not theatrical, just the expression of a person processing the distance between what they have just heard and what is on the page in front of them. Simone said, still writing, without looking up. I see. Thank you. There was a pause. Not long, perhaps 5 seconds. But it had the specific quality of a pause in which something has been registered by the people who needed to register it, and now the meeting will continue. But it has already arrived somewhere it did not expect to arrive. Then Simone looked up. She looked at me. She said, "Diana, would you like to correct anything in Professor Weissman's answer?" I said, "The footnote describes Yoruba attire, the shade specific to that process. I had the Malian reference in an earlier draft, and Dr. Afolabi helped me see why it was wrong." I paused. The footnote explains the distinction. It's on page 147. Weissman looked at page 147. He was quiet for a moment. I watched him read. I watched him find the footnote. I watched him understand what had just happened, not all of it, probably not the full significance of the silence that followed his original answer, but enough. He understood enough. He said, "I may have been misremembering the draft version." Simone wrote something else in her notebook. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. There were questions about the bibliography, about the acknowledgements, about the timeline for the index. I answered them. Weissman answered some of them. His answers were intelligent. He was not a fraud in his own field. He just did not know mine well enough to know what he did not know. At the end, Simone said she would be in touch with both of us within the week. We thanked her. We left. In the hallway, waiting for the elevator, the operational one on the left, not the one being replaced, Weissman stood next to me. He was quieter than he had been in the meeting. Something had shifted in the calculation behind his eyes, though I could not see exactly what he had calculated. He said, "You must be very confident about this book." I said, "Yes." He said, "It can be a difficult field, African studies. Not always well understood by institutional committees." I looked at him. He was looking at the elevator doors. I understood what he was doing. He was reasserting the dynamic, reminding me that I still existed within a system where he had more protection than I did, where the outcome of this meeting would not change the fundamental disparity in our positions. He was right that the field was difficult. He was right that institutional committees often did not understand it. He was saying, "I can make things harder for you." He was not saying it with menace. He was saying it with the specific sadness of a person who has realized they have lost something and is testing whether they can recover it. I said, "I know the field." The elevator arrived. We rode down in silence. In the lobby, he went left, and I went right, and we did not say anything more to each other. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk in the November cold. I could see my breath. I held the bag with the manuscript in it. I thought about a compound house in Kumasi and a woman who had been weaving since she was 11 and who had said, "The cloth knows who made it." I thought, it told her. I stood there for a few minutes. Around me the street moved, people crossing, a delivery truck double parked. someone's phone playing music through a speaker at a volume too low to identify the song. The ordinary texture of a Tuesday morning in a city, continuing without any knowledge of what had just happened 4 floors above it. I thought about what Kwame would say when I told him. He would ask, "What do you need now?" And I was already knowing the answer. Not a conversation about Weissman, not a call to a lawyer or a union rep or anyone in the institution. I needed to open the manuscript and add 2 sentences to the acknowledgments that I had been thinking about for 3 months, but had not yet written. Sentences for Dr. Afolabi, sentences for Adwoa Amankwa, sentences that would put into the permanent record of the work the names of the people who had taught me what I did not know before I knew it. The manuscript had been written. The meeting had happened. The footnote had done what it existed to do. I walked back to campus. I went up to the 3rd floor office. Kwame looked up. I said, "He said the wrong color." Kwame was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did Simone notice?" She wrote it down. He nodded. He turned back to his dissertation. I opened the manuscript to the acknowledgments page. I uncapped the blue pen. I wrote in the margin, "Add." And to Dr. Constance Afolabi, who corrected what I had gotten wrong. The footnote exists because of her. Then I wrote, "And to Edwa Amankwa, who taught me to look for the decision." I capped the pen. I put the manuscript back in the folder. Outside the window, November continued. The flat gray light that does not promise anything. The kind of day that simply persists, which is its own kind of statement. I had 7 years of work in a folder. Nobody had taken it. That was enough. For that afternoon. It was enough to start from. Here is what happened, and what did not. Simone called me 4 days later. She said the press would not proceed with a co-authorship arrangement. She said Weissman's contribution, as she could assess it from the manuscript's internal evidence, and from her 18 months of direct work with me, did not constitute co-authorship by the press's standards. She said she had discussed this with Carol Huang and with the press's legal counsel. She said she hoped I would want to continue with them. I told her I needed a few weeks to think. I also told Kwame. He listened. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to think about what I wanted the book's life to look like. Not what I was entitled to. Not what I could prove what I wanted. Because the press was a good one, and the offer was real, and Simone was a person I trusted, and none of that had changed. What had changed was my understanding of what had been happening around the book for 3 years, which was not the same as what had been happening to the book. The book was mine. It had always been mine. What had been happening around it was a separate matter. I asked myself, if I publish with this press, with Simone as my editor, does that work mean something? And the answer was yes. The work meant something regardless of Weissman. The meaning of the work was not contaminated by what he had tried to do, because what he had tried to do had not succeeded, and because the book existed as it existed with the footnote corrected, with Adwa Amankwa's name in the acknowledgments, with the argument as I had finally managed to make it. But I also asked myself, do I want to stay in a building where he is the department chair? Do I want to continue building a career in an institution where this is the kind of thing that happens without consequence? Do I want to spend the next 5 years fighting for tenure in a place that has already told me something important about how it sees people like me? The answer to those questions was also no. So I did 2 things at the same time, which felt contradictory, and turned out not to be. I thanked Simone for 18 months of serious editorial work, and told her I was going to submit the manuscript elsewhere. And I sent my CV and a writing sample to 3 universities with openings in my field. The decisions were related but not the same decision. Leaving the press was about what the book deserved. Leaving the university was about what I deserved. I want to be honest about something. The footnote was not a trap. I did not know Simone would ask about it. I did not sit in my office the night before the meeting constructing a question she would ask. I was simply, as I have been for 7 years, someone who knew their work, with the specific intimacy that comes from having been wrong about it, having found the errors, and having corrected them. That intimacy is not a strategy. It is just what 7 years of serious work looks like from the inside. But I also want to say this. The system did not protect me because it was designed to protect me. It protected me because of a specific editor who had read the work closely enough to know what a relevant question looked like, and who had the independence to ask it in a room where the answer mattered. If Simone had not been the editor, if she had read the manuscript less carefully, if she had deferred to Weissman's institutional seniority, and not held the meeting, if any of those things had been different, the outcome would have been different. I think about this sometimes. About how much of what happened depended on one person choosing to look closely. I did not go forward with that press. I submitted the manuscript, revised and expanded, to a different press, a smaller one, university-affiliated, with a strong record in African studies. They said yes within 8 weeks. The contract is in my name alone. The acknowledgements thank 37 people, including Kwame, including Dr. Afolabi, including Simone Cross, including Kofi, who spent 4 days translating between an old woman and me in a courtyard in Kumasi, and who understood more of what she was saying than I did at the time. The acknowledgements begin with my mother. I also applied to 3 positions at other universities. I received 2 offers. I accepted one, a tenure-track position at a university in another city, starting in the fall. The offer came 2 months after the editorial meeting and had nothing to do with it, except that it had something to do with the book existing, and the book existing the way it existed, and not in any other form. I think about the system a lot, about how it is structured to reward proximity to power rather than the generation of knowledge, about how adjunct positions create the conditions in which the Wisemans of the world can offer access in exchange for something that is never quite named, about how many books have been absorbed this way, how many scholars have calculated that something is better than nothing, and signed away attribution they should have kept. I do not have a solution to offer. I have one story. Mine. What I know is that the cloth knew who made it. And it told. The Woven Road, West African Textile Trade Routes and the Making of Global Fashion was published in the spring. The dedication reads, For Abina, who taught me to look at cloth the right way. For Edwa Amankwa, who taught me what I was looking for. For every woman whose work has traveled without her name. 3 weeks after the book came out, I received a letter. Not an email, a letter, written by hand on pale yellow paper, in English that moved carefully but without apology. It was from a woman named Efwa, who introduced herself as the granddaughter of Adwa Amankwa. Adwo had died the previous December, at 92. She had heard about the book. Someone had told her family about a book coming out that mentioned her grandmother specifically, in the acknowledgements and in the text. The family had found a copy. Efwa had read the chapter that discussed her grandmother's work. She wrote, She would have been pleased that you looked the right way. She said that about you, afterward. She told my mother, That woman knows how to look. That is not a common thing. I read the letter 3 times. I looked at the kente strip on my desk, which has moved now, to a new desk, in a new office in a different city, but which is in exactly the same position relative to my left hand. That is not something I planned. It is just how I set up a desk. Some positions are correct. The new office has a window that faces east. In the morning, the light comes in at a low angle and falls across the desk and across the strip of cloth, and you can see, in that specific morning light, the depth of color that does not appear in photographs, the quality that Adwoa would have called, I think, the decision made visible. I wrote back to Efua. I told her about the 4 days in the compound, about Kofi and the translation and the courtyard and the 3 looms working at once, about the voice memo I had made afterward that I have listened to more than 100 times, about the kente strip and where it lives now and how the light hits it. I told her. Her grandmother said something to me that I did not fully understand until 3 years after she said it, about looking at cloth to see the decision. I told her that I think I understand it now, at least partially, and that I expect to keep understanding it for the rest of my career. Efua wrote back in 2 days. She said, My grandmother always said that understanding arrives when you are ready for it, not when you are told. She said she would visit the US sometime in the next year, and she hoped we might meet. I said yes. I meant it. I teach 3 courses this semester. One of them is a graduate seminar on methodology in African studies. In the first session, I spent 45 minutes talking about the difference between reading an archive from the outside and knowing a process from the inside. About the gap between those 2 positions. About what it costs when that gap is not acknowledged. About what it protects when it is. A student named Priya, first year, uncertain, already forming questions she is not yet confident enough to ask, raised her hand. She said, What do you do when the knowledge you have can only be demonstrated by being asked the right question? When there's no document for it? I thought about a conference room in November. About a notebook and a woman who wrote something in it without looking up. I said, You stay close enough to your work that when the question comes, you can answer from inside it. You don't prepare for the question. You know the work. She wrote it down. I am still learning what that means. I think I will be for a long time. The kente strip is on my desk. The cloth knows who made it.